Priests and lay worshippers in Ethiopia are on a mission to replicate or even recreate centuries-old religious manuscripts and sacred artwork in efforts to preserve traditions and heritage.
The manuscripts actually arrived in December. So just now they've been taken out of the boxes, put on the shelves, and now conservation work starts.
For 60 years, an Ethiopian monk refused to speak about what was inside the manuscript on his lap. On the last night of his life, with the candle burning low and 3 disciples leaning in close, he finally opened his mouth. What came out does not match the version of Christianity the world has been handed. It is what the risen Christ actually said during the 40 days, the Gospels almost completely erased. It names a darkness already walking among us. And once you hear the words this monk spent his life protecting, you will understand why they were buried. The Bible the West never saw. Before any of that makes sense, you need to know something almost nobody in the Western world has ever been told. The Bible most of us read is not the whole Bible. Stay with me. The Western canon was locked at 66 books. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved 81. Among those extra 15 are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the books of Maccabean. Texts the earliest Christians read out loud. Texts ancient Jewish communities treated as sacred. Texts quietly cut from the Western canon without most of the people in the pews ever being told. For centuries, scholars who raised questions were dismissed or pushed out of the room. Then the laboratories showed up. Radiocarbon dating of the Garima Gospels, found inside an Ethiopian monastery, confirmed they were written between roughly 330 and 650 AD, among the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts ever found on Earth.
Thought to have been made around 350 AD in Palestine or Egypt, it's the world's oldest surviving Bible.
While Europe stumbled through its dark centuries, Ethiopian monks in mountain fortresses were preserving the original source code of the Christian faith. Untouched, unedited, unapproved by Rome. The Book of Enoch alone names 200 watcher angels who came down to earth, took human wives, and produced the Nephilim, Samyaza, Azazel, Barachiel. It describes an unauthorized handover of forbidden knowledge that nearly destroyed civilization. Rome cut it, Ethiopia kept it. But Abba Tekle was not trembling on his deathbed because of Enoch. The book in his lap was older, more dangerous. He kept tracing one passage in the margin with his thumb. The book is called the Mashafa Kedan, the Book of the Covenant, and what is written inside it is not what the world has been taught, Jesus said. The 40 days erased. The disciples around the bed had heard Abba Tekle reference this manuscript 1,000 times, but he had never read aloud from it. Now, in the candlelight, he opened to the section he had memorized at 31. He told them that most of what the world calls Christianity is built on 40 days that were almost completely deleted from the public record. Look at your own Bible. In Luke, the gap between the resurrection and the ascension, a full 40 days, is resolved in a handful of verses. The risen Christ appears, blesses the disciples, ascends. 40 days, 1 paragraph, no content. The most important teaching window in the history of the faith, handed down as a blank page. The Mashafa Kedan fills that page. According to the manuscript, the risen Christ gathered the disciples with an urgency that was nothing like comfort. More like a commander pulling his officers in before the building collapses. He did not come back to reassure anyone. He came back to warn them, and he started saying things that, if read aloud from a Western pulpit, would have made every institutional church on earth feel beside the point. He starts with the world itself. He describes wealth, status, power, the systems people build and fight over, as the playground of a deceptive force, not a metaphor. A literal entity whose entire job is to keep human beings spiritually asleep. And then, in the voice of someone who already knows what is coming, he gives them a warning the Mashafa Kedan preserves word for word. Do not build temples of stone, for the stone will crumble. Build the temple of the heart, for it is eternal. That is not poetry. That is a direct warning against the very infrastructure about to be built in his name. He predicts men in long robes who will use his name to gather gold. He warns of a future empire that will take his cross and turn it into a weapon. The specificity is what stops scholars cold. It reads like a man standing 2,000 years in the future, watching the Crusades, the Inquisitions, televangelists counting cash while the poor wait outside. Abba Tekle's finger paused beside a phrase he had circled in red ink decades ago. He looked up and said, quietly, that the manuscript was meant to be opened at a specific moment in history, that the monks had been holding it for that moment. He said only that they had reached it. If something just shifted inside your chest, that is what Abba Tekle felt the first time he read this manuscript at 31. Hit subscribe right now, because what the risen Christ said next, the diagnosis he gave the disciples about what is actually wrong with human beings, is the teaching that should have rewritten everything. And the reason it did not will tell you more about power than any history class ever did. The two winds. The risen Christ then describes the human soul like a doctor, explaining what is happening inside the body. Every human being has two winds moving through them at the same time, the wind of life and the wind of error. The wind of error, he explains, is not just sin or moral failure. He describes it as a parasite, precise, methodical, with specific entry points. It enters through greed. It enters through the eyes when they look at what they should not. It enters through the mouth when it speaks deception. And once it takes hold, it calcifies the heart. It turns a living, breathing human being into what the manuscript calls a walking tomb. Someone who wakes up, goes through the motions, scrolls, and consumes and sleeps, but whose inner world has already gone cold. He was not describing some future condition. He was describing something already spreading in his own time. That image has been sitting in an Ethiopian monastery for 2,000 years, and almost nobody knows it exists. After the warning comes the antidote, not a sacrament, not a ritual, not membership in any institution. The Mashafa Kidan calls it gnosis, knowledge. Direct, internal, personal knowledge of the truth that needs no middleman, no priest, no bishop standing between you and God. He teaches the disciples to watch their own thoughts, the way a guard watches a city gate. And then comes the line that would have made every institutional church on earth feel pointless. The kingdom of heaven, he tells them, is literally inside the human body, hidden in the silence between thoughts. Picture the average person inside the Roman Empire actually believing that. They would have stopped paying temple taxes. They would have stopped fearing excommunication. They would have become, in the language of every empire that has ever existed, completely uncontrollable. Abba Tekle reached the end of the passage and stopped. He told the disciples his teacher had said there was a reason this section was buried so deep. He said what was coming next was the teaching he himself had spent 60 years protecting with his life. Then he closed his eyes, and the candle flickered, and the disciples did not breathe. The warning in his own face. When Abba Tekle opened his eyes, his voice changed, lower, slower, like a man finally about to speak the sentence everything else has been pointing at. The next thing the risen Christ says in the Mashafa Kidan is the line Ethiopian monks have been protecting across 2,000 years of silence. The line that should have been the most famous warning in Christian history, and was buried instead. He tells the disciples that a darkness is coming, and that it will wear his face. Stop there, sit with that. Not a monster arriving in the night, not an obvious villain. A deception so precise, so beautifully built, that it would look exactly like him. It would speak his name, carry his cross, build cathedrals in his honor, print his words on the inside covers of the very books it would use to control entire populations. The exact instrument of spiritual destruction everything he taught was designed to stop. The Antichrist, in this manuscript, is not a future tyrant in a single body. It is a system. The Ethiopian monks who guarded this passage believed the system was not coming. It had already arrived. Abba Tekle had read those words 10,000 times. The disciples watched him press his shaking hand flat against the page. He looked at them and said, quietly, that this was what he had carried. He had read it every morning of his adult life, waiting. And he believed the world had walked into the moment those words were written for. The Ark under guard. What Abba Tekle was protecting connects to something most people do not know, is sitting in northern Ethiopia right now. Ethiopia has maintained, for nearly 3,000 years, that the Ark of the Covenant is here. Locked inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, in the ancient city of Aksum, not a legend, not a metaphor. Under guard, behind a curtain at this moment. The story is preserved in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's royal chronicle. The Queen of Sheba travels to Jerusalem, meets Solomon, returns to Ethiopia carrying his son, Menelik I. When Menelik later goes back to visit his father, Solomon offers him the throne of Israel. Menelik refuses. According to the Kebra Nagast, he and his companions then quietly replace the Ark in the Holy of Holies with a replica and carry the original back to Africa.
The faithful believe that the Queen of Sheba left Ethiopia, went to Jerusalem, where she met King Solomon. From that meeting came a son, and when the son was an adult, he returned to Ethiopia with 12,000 Israelites and the Ark of the Covenant, containing the tablets with the Word of God, the Ten Commandments.
Now, read the biblical accounts of what the Ark actually does. It incinerated armies. It struck people dead on contact when they touched it without authorization. It released fire that had no natural explanation. When scholars stop reading those accounts as mythology and start reading them as a technical description, what they describe sounds uncomfortably close to something giving off sustained radiation. There is only ever one guardian at a time. He is chosen. He enters the chapel. He never leaves again. Visitors who have observed guardians across generations report the same pattern. Eyesight that fails early, cataracts in middle age, skin that pales, death that arrives well before it should. Abba Tekla had known one of those guardians as a young monk. He told the disciples the man's eyes had gone milky white before he was 40, that he had spoken about a humming in the air behind the curtain that nobody else could hear. The disciples had heard Abba Tekla mention this guardian only once before. Now he said the man had told him something else, something he had been waiting until this moment to pass on, and then he turned the page. Churches that cannot exist. The Ark is half of what Ethiopia is sitting on. Lalibela is the other half. King Lalibela did not build 11 churches. He carved them downward into solid volcanic rock. Entire cathedrals, windows, doors, columns, drainage systems, all cut from single continuous pieces of stone, excavated from the inside of a mountain. This is not a technique that allows mistakes. There is no patching a cracked column in solid volcanic rock. Every dimension had to exist perfectly inside the architect's head before a chisel touched anything. Modern structural engineers have studied these buildings. To carve all 11 using 12th century tools,
when you're carving a church out of the mountainside, you don't have that luxury. And so typically in any one of the churches here, you get good stone, and a lot of it is good stone.
Would require approximately 40,000 skilled workers, working without stopping for well over a century. The project is officially attributed to a 24-year window. The math does not work, and the rock that was removed, millions of tons, is not there. The stone was there. The churches are there. The stone is gone. The monks have always known the explanation. Human workers carved during the day. At night, according to the ancient accounts, angels descended and continued the work using what those accounts describe as tools of light that pass through solid rock without friction. Directed energy. That is not mythology, that is technology. Ethiopian tradition places the Ark in active use during this window. The most famous of the 11 is the Church of St. George, a perfect cross carved straight down into the earth until the roof sits flush with ground level. Beneath the complex runs a network of pitch-black tunnels where candidates for the priesthood are sent alone in complete darkness to navigate by touch and sound. The theology of the Mashafa Kidan carved into the architecture itself. You must pass through the darkness before you are given the light. Abba Tekla had walked those tunnels at 28 before his vows. He told the disciples the priests had recently allowed 3D laser scans, and the scans had revealed hollow chambers beneath the floors that have not been opened in 8 centuries. He stopped. He said his teacher had told him what was actually in them. And then he said the next chapter, the one about who Jesus actually was, would explain why those chambers must stay closed. The bloodline deleted. In Western Christianity, Jesus has no descendants. The story ends at the cross and picks back up in heaven. His family line is treated as irrelevant. In Ethiopia, that silence is unthinkable. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty ruled for nearly 3,000 years, from roughly 900 BC until 1974. One unbroken royal lineage. The last emperor, Haile Selassie, was the 225th ruler in that chain. His official title was the Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, not a poetic flourish, a legal claim, a direct biological line traced all the way back to King David. That does not just connect Ethiopia to the Old Testament, it connects Ethiopia to the New Testament in a way Western theology has no clean way to handle. If Mary, the mother of Jesus, came from the house of David, and Ethiopia's royal dynasty traced the same bloodline for 3,000 years, then the relationship between Ethiopia and Christ was never just theological. It was family. Modern genetics walked into this conversation and stopped being polite. DNA studies of Ethiopian populations have identified ancient genetic markers from the Levant, dating back roughly 3,000 years. Not symbolic migration, actual migration, real people who left Jerusalem and settled in Ethiopia. The oral traditions turned out to be sitting inside the genome the whole time. This is also why Ethiopian Christianity looks so different from its Western cousin, the Saturday Sabbath, circumcision on the 8th day, Levitical dietary laws, all kept. The Ethiopian church did not borrow Jewish practice. It never let go of it. Abba Tekle paused on this section longer than any other. In the highlands, he said, oral traditions still speak of a teacher who arrived from the north, a healer, a man whose way of speaking was unlike anything the people had encountered. They do not call him Jesus. They call him the righteous teacher. They do not record where he came from. They do not record where he went. They only say that after he arrived, something changed. Abba Tekle looked up. He told the disciples his teacher had told him who the righteous teacher actually was. Then he said it was not yet his place to repeat it, not in this life. The aphorism passed down through the Ethiopian church carries the weight of people who know something the rest of the world has been told to forget. The West has the water. Ethiopia has the well. Why the seal breaks now? A question almost no one has thought to ask. Why now? These manuscripts survived insect damage, military invasions, regime collapses, and the full force of colonial erasure. The monks who guarded them were not archivists. They were seals. Human seals over information so dangerous to institutional power that those institutions spent 17 centuries making sure most people never learned it existed. Then, in just a few short years, the seal breaks. The Mashafa Kidan describes the conditions of the end times using a phrase in Ge'ez that translates as webs of illusion, a world hyper-connected but fundamentally false, where people communicate without physical voices, where they see without physical eyes, where information travels faster than truth, and the manufactured image replaces lived reality. That is the internet. That is social media. That is the early architecture of artificial intelligence, described with a precision that should not be possible in a text 2,000 years old. This is the moment Abba Tekle had been pointing toward all night.
The applications of multispectral imaging for the British Library include recovering erased and faded text, recovering information that has been lost due to damage over time, water damage, fire damage, anywhere where there's text that has become illegible over time.
The theory inside the Ethiopian monastic tradition is that the monks were maintaining a timed release, an emergency document designed from the start to be opened at one specific threshold moment in human history. The trigger was not a date. The trigger was a description, and the present moment is sitting inside that description. Trust in governments collapsed. Trust in media collapsed. Trust in organized religion declining at the fastest rate in modern history. People are starving for something direct, unmediated. That is what the Mashafa Kidan offers. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD did not just organize Christianity. It carried out a targeted disarmament. The books that were removed were cut because they described human beings as spiritually free agents with direct access to the divine who needed no priestly middleman. Cut those books, and you take away the reader's armor. Ethiopia never accepted that. The three teachings. Abba Tekle was 91. His hands were no longer shaking. The candle had burned down by half. He told the disciples the 3 teachings the risen Christ delivered during those 40 hidden days were not theological curiosities. They were a survival kit, built for exactly this moment, for people living inside manufactured realities, starving for something real. The first teaching: do not build temples of stone, for the stone will crumble. Build the temple of the heart, for it is eternal. The institution cannot save you, the building cannot hold the divine. Go inward, or do not go at all. The second teaching: the kingdom of heaven is literally inside the human body, hidden in the silence between thoughts. The thing the modern world has been searching for is not behind a paywall. It is inside you, in the place where thought stops and something else begins. The third teaching: the one he said last, the one he said quietly, as if the walls themselves had ears. The darkness will come, and it will wear my face. Abba Tekle told the disciples this was the teaching he had spent 60 years protecting. Not because it was the most mystical, because it was the most immediately useful. The thing the risen Christ warned about, the deception that would speak his name and carry his cross, was not coming. It was already here. The only protection was the first 2 teachings. Go inward. Find the silence. Do not mistake the costume for the man. The candle went out. Abba Tekle died before morning. His disciples have carried those words ever since. After 2,000 years of silence, the well is finally open. Subscribe right now, because the next video opens the chamber Abba Tekle said could not be opened, and reveals what his teacher told him is sitting beneath the floors of Lalibela.